Well, good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are. I'm Julius Genachowski. I'm the chairman of the Federal Communications Commission, and it is my great privilege to welcome each of you to our first ever online global policy meeting. And the topic, of course, is our recently issued National Broadband Plan. At the FCC, we are committed to greater international engagement and cooperation in our interconnected world. Together we can work to ensure that communications and information technology advance our collective goals of peace and prosperity. Now, as I mentioned, this past week the FCC released America's first National Broadband Plan. We are very proud of this effort. You'll hear over the course of this morning some description of the process that we went through to develop this plan, a multi-month process that was open and fact-based and data-driven, broadly participatory and consultative, and you'll hear more about that. As part of our consultations, we looked outside the United States. Our team has had meetings and briefings with over 24 foreign countries, many of whom had developed their own broadband plans. In the course of developing this national broadband plan, we learned a great deal from the work of other countries. And today we'd like to share with you the results of our national broadband plan. As many of you have concluded in your broadband plans, broadband, high-speed internet, is indispensable infrastructure for the 21st century, the foundation in the 21st century for economic growth and democracy in the digital age. It's a platform for opportunity, for economic growth, for job creation. It's a platform for innovation, enabling anyone, anywhere to dream big and bring those dreams to life. It's a platform for solutions to many of the challenges that face all of our nations: education, healthcare, energy, public safety. My colleagues today will discuss the details of our plan to realize the promise of broadband for all Americans. First, let me briefly highlight some of the plan's guiding principles. One, processes that are open, participatory, fact-based, and analytically rigorous. Two, the essential role here of private investment in extending broadband networks across our country. Three, the profound importance of vibrant competition to bringing consumers the best services at the best prices and to spur world-leading innovation and ongoing investment. Next, the necessity of tackling vital inclusion challenges and promoting universal digital literacy so that everyone everywhere can enjoy the benefits of a broadband internet that is open, safe, and trusted. Next, the need to reorient 20th century policies toward the 21st century. And finally, a recognition that government has a crucial but restrained role to play, focusing with laser-like precision on efficient and effective solutions. These are the principles that will also guide our plan's implementation, which is, of course, what we have now turned to, and I hope and expect that they'll be relevant to all nations trying to tackle these issues. Once again, thank you all for participating. I hope you find today's conference enlightening. I look forward to continuing collaboration. With that, it is my pleasure to welcome the key members of our broadband team who have worked so hard on this plan, led by Blair, Levin, who's the executive director of our Omnibus Broadband Initiative, Phil Bellaria, John Horrigan, Rob Curtis, Carol Maddy, Kristen Kane, and Eric Garr. I would tell all of you that the work that this team has done has been truly incomparable in what I have seen in my prior 10 years in government or 10 years in the private sector. This group worked day and night for many, many months with a focus on identifying the hardest challenges and obstacles to a broadband future, and very focused on developing smart, strategic, fact-based solutions. A truly professional organization committed to finding the right answers to difficult questions, and I couldn't be more proud of the incredible work that they've done. Let me first, to be the MC of today's briefing, welcome the chief of the FCC's International Bureau, Mindel de la Torre. Mindel has worked very hard in the several months now that she has been chief of the Bureau to keep us connected to all of our counterparts around the world. I'm extremely pleased that today we are using advanced technology, that we are using the Internet to communicate effectively and efficiently with a global audience. And I thank Mindel Torre for organizing this conference today, and I hope it is the beginning of many such events, meetings, conferences to keep us connected. So with that, thank you again, everyone, for joining, and I hand it over to Mindel Torre.
Thank you very much, Chairman Genachowski. I'd also like to welcome our colleagues and government agencies and international organizations from around the world to the very first of what we hope will be many online global policy meetings. Over the last several months, I've had the pleasure, as the chairman said, of exchanging ideas with you at various venues on ways to encourage broadband deployment and adoption. I'm very pleased today that we are able to use broadband technology, as the chairman said, to be able to be online with so many different people from different countries around the various time zones. We saw that we have even people from India, which is basically across the world. So we do appreciate that very much, so that we can share our experiences on the details of the U.S. National Broadband Plan. And I'm not sure if I hold it up, if people can see what it looks like. And this is meant to be an interactive conference, and so please feel free to submit your comments and questions that you may have on through the chat room that's on the top right-hand corner of your screen, and we will address the comments that have been submitted after all the presentations are finished, so you can actually be sending those during the presentations, but we will address those at the end. And before I turn the floor over to the FCC broadband team of experts, I would like to provide a brief international perspective of the plan. All around the world, each country has unique beginnings, discoveries, and inventions, but we all share a need for critical infrastructure to survive and thrive. We all need transportation, whether it's by plane, train, automobile, or by some for donkey, by foot, or in the case of my son, by skateboard. We need electricity, we need water, but we can't forget that communications is an essential component also of critical infrastructure. As Chairman Genachowski noted, broadband is indispensable for infrastructure for the 21st century, a need we all share in order to continue to thrive. Although the National Broadband Plan that we discussed today focuses on specific strategies to transform U.S. broadband deployment and adoption, broadband policy also unfolds in an interdependent international market full of opportunities and challenges. Global trade in information and communications technology, also known as ICT, is almost $4 trillion and growing. All countries are affected by ICT development. So, simply put, ubiquitous availability of broadband and universal connectivity enables people and entities around the world to communicate on a global basis, and this in turn increases productivity and enables innovation. Now, someone recently asked me, why should we care about other countries' national broadband plans and vice versa? Why would anyone really care about, our plan, and would they be curious about our plan? And my answer to that is that we can all benefit from sharing best practices and collaborating on the successes of our national plans to improve access to broadband service around the globe. As the chairman mentioned, in the case of the U.S. National Broadband Plan, the team looked at broadband deployment in other countries in order to learn from their experiences. Some members of the broadband team traveled overseas to get firsthand information on what other countries are doing. And they also met here. We have had various meetings with other countries here. And sometimes the answer was surprisingly simple. They had developed a broadband plan or a strategy for the government and the ICT sector. And that had resulted in implementations and bringing benefits in terms of ICT growth and national applications in their own countries. In addition to having these face-to-face meetings with many of you, the FCC's broadband team held many public workshops to gather information and data, and one was specifically dedicated to international lessons learned. Another workshop that we held was on global broadband, which focused on universal connectivity and applications like telemedicine and teleeducation, which already have enormous power and benefits around the world from one country to the next. This outreach basically helped the broadband team to be able to use information that was gathered from experiences in other countries in formulating the U.S. plan. And now that we've adopted that plan, we hope that the ideas in it will serve as useful examples for other countries that are currently developing their plans, and that this is just a first step in a continual exchange of information. As Chief of the International Bureau, I know how important it is for us to have conversations with each other, to hear new, innovative, and diverse ideas, and to share our experiences, so that we not only learn, but we can avoid past experiences that may not have worked and take advantage of those that did for the benefit of others. Another reason that international broadband plans are relevant to others is that international cooperation is essential to achieve the goals in those plans. For example, as our broadband team discovered, reliable data on broadband deployments is essential for formulating sound policy. However, it's sometimes difficult to draw conclusions based on existing international data because each country uses different methodologies to collect that data in their market. It would be helpful if there were a harmonized method for collecting data. And this may be something that we may be able to pursue together, particularly through statistical surveys of organizations like the OECD and the ITU. Again, this online meeting today is meant to be an interactive discussion, so I encourage you to participate by sending in your comments. And I'll now hand it over to Blair Levin, the Director of the Omnibus Broadband Initiative Team, who will provide an introduction of the plan and start us going this morning. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mindel, and welcome everybody. As Mindel mentioned, our plan, like all national plans, reflects the realities of the nation doing them. In particular, the United States has some distinguishing characteristics from most other countries. Our market structure is different. We have a far greater both availability of cable broadband as well as actual market share. Our country has the largest cable market share of any country in the world. Secondly, our regulatory structure is quite different. A lot of countries have a single federal regulator that does all the regulation of the communications platform. We share jurisdiction between the federal government and the state government. We also, most countries have a single national telco player, which is the dominant player. Our telco providers tend to be regional. And in addition, America has certain strengths and weaknesses in the broadband ecosystem that our plan tried to reflect. Nonetheless, hopefully our plan will have some value, and what I'd like to do today is talk about first the process that we used to see if that has value, secondly some of the themes we developed, and third talk about our approach to competition, innovation and investment, that even though it may be different in all countries, there are certain elements that we think might be useful. First, in terms of process, we essentially used a three-stage process. The first stage was just trying to open up the discussion to try to figure out what the range of issues were and what we should be focused on. And we did that through about a 6-week process of public workshops where we threw out a bunch of different issues, invited people from all over, from many different parts of what we might think of as the broadband ecosystem, and just kicked around lots of ideas in a very open way. We then took what we learned from those workshops and moved into the second phase, which was really trying to drill down into very specific policy agendas. And we did this through a series of what we called public notices, where we would go out and we would ask in a very open and transparent way, how do we address these issues which have been raised in the workshops, asking for very concrete data. And then the final part of the process was to take that data, really drill down into try to develop very concrete, specific policy proposals. We also field tested a lot of those proposals by a series of field hearings and in other ways, telling the public what we were thinking about, getting some quick reaction. And over the course of about 8 months, we were able to develop the plan that Mindel mentioned. In terms of themes that we think have applicability to pretty much any country, I'd mention the following. First, as we look out over the next 10 years, probably the biggest threat to a healthy broadband ecosystem that would be generally applicable to all countries is the availability of spectrum. Obviously, broadband is moving to a mobile platform as well as to a fixed platform. but spectrum is the one input that cannot be manufactured. We all have what we have. And the biggest problem that we found is that spectrum is generally allocated on the basis of history, not markets. So it sometimes, as the demand for spectrum grows, unlike demand for other goods and services, the market doesn't always have the ability to send signals that allows for the reallocation and recapture of spectrum. So that's something, we'll talk more about that when we have the specific presentation on spectrum, but something that all countries need to be concerned about. Second is one needs to be able to create opportunities, spectrum-based opportunities with different markets. We think there's a need for both licensed and unlicensed. We also think there's a need for secondary uses, which requires greater transparency than we're currently using. So in spectrum planning, you have to kind of create headroom for how different technologies may evolve. And third, that the worst use of spectrum is no use, particularly when the lack of use comes from the government's failure to make certain decisions to clarify the rules that would allow investment into a spectrum-based business model. And so a lot of our plan tries to clarify certain government rules or lead to certain decisions, particularly relating to spectrum that has been lying fallow even after it's been allocated. A second theme was how government affects the price of other key inputs for the broadband ecosystem, particularly how it controls rights of way, and that government has to be very conscious that of what it is doing, because it can add to the price and therefore diminish the amount of broadband in the marketplace. A third is that we talk about broadband as if it's a single thing. In fact, there are two very important ways we do it. One is through fixed and the other is through mobile. And it's important for all countries to have both. There are different uses, but it's very important that we certainly don't think that any country should only focus on one or the other. And this leads to a similar kind of insight in terms of it's really important that people understand different markets. There is a mass market for broadband, but that's very different than what we might think of as an institutional market. And so there's going to be needs for huge connectivity for example, hospitals, schools, businesses, whereas for individuals, you can have less connectivity. But if you don't make that distinction and you think that there's a kind of single goal for broadband everywhere, we think that misunderstands how the market is going to be segmenting. Another theme was that the most important thing is not the speed per se of the broadband network. The most important thing is how people actually use broadband. So you have to have a healthy ecosystem of good networks, great devices, and above all, a very healthy applications market that really incentivize people to use it. It's really the overall value proposition for the public that matters most, not a single characteristic such as speed of an individual network or price of an individual service. And that leads us to what we discovered was that the largest gap, we think, in the United States is what we call the national purposes. We'll be talking about that more. But it was very, very striking that certain segments of our economy have really understood how profound the change is and are quickly adopting the tools that are available because of broadband. But key sectors for driving our civic life, for driving how we educate ourselves and how we make ourselves healthy, have not grasped that or have certain barriers to using broadband. And our plan spends a lot of time talking about how to drive down those barriers. And finally, I would note that it's something that I think is particularly true for the United States, but really true around the world, and something that Mindel was talking about, is the way that broadband essentially weakens what we might think of as governmental jurisdictional boundaries. One of the things we found as a barrier to internet, to broadband use in education and healthcare, for example, were certain state rules that make it more difficult for a doctor in, say, New York State to provide a service in Iowa, the state of Iowa, even though that doctor may be able to provide the most effective and cost-effective means of providing a certain service. So that's something that we have to grapple with. Other countries may be in the same kind of situation. Other countries with simply a central government may not. but the same is going to be true for international laws. And so we all need to work together to make sure that the way we construct our boundaries don't interfere with the use. So finally, let me conclude by talking about competition, innovation, and investment. And again, as I noted, the United States has a very different market structure. But we approached how we would achieve certain national goals not by saying that there was any silver bullet, but by focusing on different market dynamics and how to make sure that those market dynamics are working in a way that constantly drives innovation, constantly speeds up the velocity of commerce. For example, one goal is to make sure that 100 million American homes by the year 2020 have access to actual, affordable 100 megabits downstream. And we do this not with a single recommendation, but by putting different market dynamics in place. For example, one of the important reasons why we need more spectrum, we don't believe that a spectrum-based solution is going to drive to that level of performance, but if you have sufficient spectrum, mobile spectrum driving 10 or 20 megabits down, it forces the wireline carriers to have to upgrade their networks. And so that's an important part of the solution. Another thing we're doing is having greater transparency for consumers, believing that if they can see what they're getting compared to what else is available in the neighborhood, that will drive all the providers to have to increase the quality. Third, as I mentioned earlier, we want to reduce the cost of rights-of-way, particularly where government controls those, so that increases the ability of new entrants to enter specific markets, but also, and just as importantly, lowers the cost of the existing entrants, of the existing players when they upgrade their services. And then we also want to pull from above. That is to say, make sure that there are applications that pull the market in an organic function rather than by government fiat to that 100 megabits. We do various things in terms of the national purposes, healthcare applications, education applications, public safety applications, and other government-based applications that help drive that performance level. But also we're doing certain experiments here in the United States of very, very high speed performance. For example, the company Google has offered to wire up various communities with ultra high bandwidth. Yesterday, a very distinguished college in Cleveland, Ohio, Case Western, announced a project that they're doing to bring their really great network to the areas surrounding the schools, something very similar to what Google is doing. And we have a proposal in our plan to provide the same kind of ultra-high connectivities to military bases to test out, provide a test bed for these high-speed applications that, again, we think will drive the market. A second thing I might mention is we have a goal for a gigabit to every community in the anchor institutions. This is all part of the same system. We think it's really important, as I mentioned earlier, that we understand the difference between an individual's need and institutional needs. We need to support in every community the healthcare facilities, the governmental facilities, public safety facilities, and educational facilities, as well as others, having very high levels of connectivity, because they certainly are going to be able to benefit from better and better applications. One of the things we suggest in the plan is that while there's a need to support that kind of connectivity with certain kinds of subsidies, as we are already doing, it may also be true that we need to make sure that there are institutions that are focused on providing that kind of level of connectivity. And this requires a certain kind of sophisticated buyer that can aggregate demand from a variety of institutions and hopefully help contribute to making it both more affordable and more practical to get these ultra-high levels of connectivity. There also in the future that the plan talks about, there may be usage issues. Right now in our country, generally people buy unlimited buckets of use. The companies have talked about that they may need to put caps on usage or price them differently, tier them differently. The market will drive that, but we want to make sure that for certain national purpose usage, that if somebody is using high levels of bandwidth for medical reasons, that they don't suffer a penalty because they need it for that. So those are some of what we think of as thematic lessons that may have more general applicability than just to the United States. And with that, Mindel, I'll just turn it over to Phil Bellaria, who is our Director of Scenario Planning, ran a variety of different scenarios for what might happen in the future, and he's going to discuss our findings on spectrum.
Thank you, Blair. Excuse me for a minute while I fast forward through the slides as the guinea pig here. And I'd like to thank everybody for participating in this conference, especially those who are participating on Friday evening or late Friday night. I really appreciate your joining us for this discussion. We had one driving motivation in terms of our effort on spectrum, and that is mobile broadband promises to be transformative to both the U.S. and the world economy, driving productivity gains, job growth, innovative applications in healthcare, energy conservation, and public safety, as has been mentioned. And secondly, mobile broadband promises to be both complementary and competitive to fixed broadband providers. So those were important considerations for us, and that guided a lot of our efforts in terms of our efforts on spectrum. And then we also had a couple key principles underlying what we sought to do. First, as Blair mentioned, move from specified historical uses for spectrum towards more flexible use. Secondly, we wanted to establish or reinvigorate market mechanisms to enable that movement of spectrum to its most productive uses, with, of course, having some backstops to ensure public interest continue to be met. And then finally, we sought to accommodate and even foster alternative access models like unlicensed and like opportunistic uses that I'll speak of in more detail in a minute. So first, the proliferation of new devices and even device categories that enable higher broadband utilization in combination with hundreds of thousands of new mobile applications serving both consumer purposes and also national purposes. It's all really reliant on, as Blair mentioned, this fixed resource, the fixed resource being the spectrum bands, and in particular, really only a segment of this overall frequency allocation chart that's most useful for mobile broadband. So we realize that we have a fixed resource and we need to be very smart about how we allocate its use. That in combination with exploding trends in the growth of mobile traffic, along with relatively small amounts of new spectrum coming online, indicated to us that we have an impending spectrum crisis, as we called it. So growth in mobile data traffic is projected to increase to about 30x where it was in 2009. At the same time, the supply of spectrum for mobile broadband uses that we're bringing to market over the last couple of years has grown about 3 times, and the current pipeline will take it to about 4 times what it was before. So we've got a difference between demand growing 30 times and supply growing only 4 times. And that tells us, okay, we need to transform how we think about spectrum policy and take a more holistic view. It can't just be about getting more spectrum allocated to mobile broadband, although that's important. We can't increase the supply 30 times to meet demand, and so we also need to look at ways to generate more efficient use through private investment and through policy changes, and also ways that we can foster more ways to access the spectrum. And going through this process, as Blair mentioned, we identified through quite a bit of public input, both through public notices and other means of generating public input, and through workshops, a series of gaps in terms of where we are right now with our policy versus where we need to be. The first is it's really hard to figure out who's operating where and at what time in the spectrum band. So there's just a general lack of transparency. That information is out there and available in multiple databases, but it can't be accessed very easily in a user-friendly way, either by policymakers or by the public. Second, our current tactics of relocating incumbents and then auctioning the spectrum may become more limited in the future as we look to other spectrum bands in order to reallocate to mobile broadband. So our current tools that we have for spectrum reallocation may not be sufficient looking forward in order to provide the right incentives for participants to relocate. Third, as I just mentioned, the projections for demand are going to far exceed any projections for supply that we can bring on. So that in combination with the amount of time it takes in order to free up more spectrum for mobile broadband use, which on average in the U.S. has been about 6 to 13 years, means that if we foresee a demand growing at the rate that we foresee right now, and we expect a crisis in 2015 or 2020, we need to start acting now. It's too late if we start acting when the crisis is actually upon us. Fourth, in many areas, the choke point is not the last mile, so the connection between the tower and the user, but the choke point is in the middle mile, the backhaul part. And this is true especially in some rural areas. And so we really wanted to look at what can we do to bring more microwave spectrum to use for backhaul purposes. Fifth, no spectrum band is used across all three dimensions of spectrum, right? So no spectrum band is used across the entire geography at which it's allocated, all the frequency bands through which it is allocated, and at all times. And so we wanted to look at what are some other access models to take advantage of that fact. So if any given spectrum band is not being used fully across geography, frequency, and time, how can we open up that band to use for other people in an opportunistic way? And then finally, we needed to think very broadly. We need to think very broadly, not just about commercial spectrum, but about commercial and federal, state, and other government spectrum. And we also need to think very broadly in the international world about how we can align our policies with those of other countries. So that gets us to the recommendations in the plan. So the first one gets to the first gap that I mentioned, and that is to bring more a greater transparency in allocation and utilization of spectrum. The first thing we launched in conjunction with the release of the plan was a spectrum dashboard, a beta version which is now live through the FCC website, which provides much greater visibility into who is using given spectrum bands at given geographies. We expect to continue to evolve the spectrum dashboard to include more bands and also solicit feedback from the public about how we can make it more user-friendly and more useful for their purposes. The second thing in this area that we recommend is measuring utilization in a scientific, statistically valid way, similar to what has been done in other countries, particularly in the UK through Ofcom. So we have a good understanding of who's using what at what time and how efficient that use is being employed. And then finally, we recognize that this plan is really the first step in an ongoing process. So we recommend an ongoing strategic spectrum plan, including an assessment of spectrum allocations conducted every 3 years to make sure that we stay on top of the most productive uses that are out there. So the second area of recommendations are around incentives. This is, again, back to the point of how do we get more spectrum in the hands of the most productive users. The first recommendation is around incentive auctions. And when we say incentive auctions, we mean an auction where the FCC has authority to share proceeds from that auction with incumbent users as a way to give them incentives to relocate out of that band. In addition, we've asked the United States Congress for authority to assess spectrum fees on commercial users, particularly commercial users who do not have flexible use licenses, and then also to grant authority to our counterpart, the NTIA, to assess spectrum fees on federal government users. The third area is around how do we get more spectrum out to market for mobile broadband. And the recommendation here is within 10 years, make an additional 500 megahertz of spectrum available for flexible use, 300 of which to make available within 5 years for mobile use. So in these cases, in particular on the 300 megahertz objective, we looked at several bands. We looked at the 700 megahertz D block, which is 10 megahertz spectrum. We looked at the WCS band, which is about 20 megahertz, AWS 2 and 3, which is up to 60 megahertz, the mobile satellite spectrum, which is 90 megahertz, and then the broadcast TV spectrum to make available an additional 120 megahertz. And I think that adds up to 300. And the important concept here is to make available. So in some cases, this spectrum can be made available through changes in the technical rules that free up that spectrum for use of mobile broadband where it may not be able to be used economically in that way right now. In other cases, making that spectrum available means having to relocate existing users from that band through some of the incentives that I talked about, incentive auctions, spectrum fees, and so forth, in order to free it up for mobile broadband use. So the fourth area of recommendations are around wireless backhaul. And here, this is another example where we can inject more flexibility in the rules in order to free up spectrum that's already allocated for these purposes but not being fully utilized. So principles like spectrum sharing on the microwave bands, spatial reuse, and changing other technical rules are important considerations here that can open up more spectrum for backhaul and help solve some of the bottlenecks in the middle mile parts of our networks. Fifth area is around opportunistic uses, and here, as Blair mentioned, we fundamentally do believe in the principle of allocating some spectrum for unlicensed use because of its ability to foster innovation. There are numerous examples of this happening, in particular the Wi-Fi example in the 2.4 gigahertz band that has fostered a lot of innovation that has then been applied to other bands, things like MIMO and other technologies that were leveraged first for Wi-Fi because of the need to operate in very congested spectrum bands at very low power. The second principle in the opportunistic uses is really building off of the effort that we put in place with TV white spaces. So TV white spaces are the concept that the Commission has pursued to open up unused spectrum within the TV bands to enable opportunistic uses, and the technologies underlying that include both database technologies to understand who's using what frequency bands where, so that the opportunistic users can access that information and not create interference, but also other technologies like spectrum sensing and cognitive radio technologies. So what we want to do is apply that concept and all the groundwork that's been put into TV white spaces into other potential spectrum bands, again to solve that problem around no frequency band is being used across all three dimensions, time, geography, and frequency. And then finally, we've recommended a greater emphasis on research and development to further facilitate the technologies that can apply towards opportunistic use going forward. And then the final set of recommendations are really around, again, being more inclusive in the policy-making process to make sure we work collaboratively with NTIA, which is, again, our sister agency that regulates spectrum usage for the federal government, but also on the international framework to promote innovative and flexible approaches to global spectrum allocation to accommodate technological advances, especially in converged services and devices. And then finally, a situation that's fairly unique to the U.S. We certainly want to make sure we work very closely with Native American tribes who have their own unique governance structure so that they can fully take advantage of mobile broadband also. And with that, then I will pass off to John Horrigan.
Thank you very much, Phil, and thanks everybody for participating today. I'm going to talk about the inclusion recommendations in the National Broadband Plan. And the inclusion portion of the broadband plan was framed not only by the workshops that Blair and Mindel mentioned in their remarks, but also by a national survey that the FCC conducted to understand who has broadband and who does not. This slide walks through, at a high level, some of the key survey findings that we came up with. We did conduct a national random digit dial telephone survey of 5,005 adults, which for a national survey is quite a large sample size, which helped us draw more reliable statistical inferences. And we found that 65% of Americans have broadband at home. That represents about a doubling in broadband adoption from 2005. So broadband adoption has been on a steady upward path in the U.S. over the past several years. But as of the end of 2009, we find that 2/3 of Americans roughly have broadband at home. We also asked people how much they pay per month for broadband, and you can see that on average people pay about $41 per month for their broadband internet service. A great deal of time in the survey was devoted to non-adoption and understanding non-adoption. So if 65% of Americans have broadband at home, that means 35% do not. And the non-adopters sort into three baskets from our survey findings. 22% of Americans are not internet users. They tell us that they simply do not go online and use the internet, either from home, from work, or from someplace else. 6% of Americans are still dial-up internet users, a number that's been on the decline steadily in the U.S. over the past several years. And then 6% of Americans are online users who do not access the internet from home. They may access the internet principally at work, or for some low-income Americans in particular, from places such as libraries or community centers. It's also worth pointing out that of non-adopters, there's a fairly small number who don't go online simply because the infrastructure is not available where they live. In our survey and in some of the other analysis that the deployment team did, we found that about 5% of Americans do not have broadband infrastructure available where they live. This means that non-adoption in the U.S. is mainly about people who have access to the infrastructure but for some reason do not get it. So you can think about 30% of Americans fall into the category of people who have broadband available where they live, but for some reason do not take the service. So, what are the reasons that people don't have broadband at home? In the survey, we went about this in a fairly deliberate way. We asked people to select from a list of different reasons why they may not have broadband, the different reasons that they don't have broadband. So people could choose more than one reason that they cite for not having broadband service. And actually a key takeaway from the survey is that non-adoption is a problem with multiple dimensions. The typical non-adopter cites more than one reason for not having broadband. That could be cost, that could be reasons related to digital literacy, or other factors. So in stage one of this part of the survey, we did ask people to list their reasons for non-adoption. And then step two was to try to pin them down on the primary reason that they do not have broadband at home. And the figures you see on this slide are the results of the second question, asking people what the main reason for not having broadband at home was. And you can see that the leading reason is cost. 36% of non-adopters say that cost is the main reason they don't have broadband at home. And that cost issue itself has several different dimensions. 15% of non-adopters say the monthly fee for service is too expensive. 10% say they cannot afford a computer. 9% either can't afford the activation fee or are reluctant to enter into a long-term contract for service. 22% of non-adopters cite reasons pertaining to digital literacy as the reason they do not have broadband at home. And that means they either don't have the comfort level or skills with computers to be online, or they're worried about the potential hazards to being online, such as security of their personal information. Another 19% of non-adopters cite lack of relevance as a reason they do not have broadband at home. And you can think of this reason as dial-up users who are just content with their basic dial-up service. They are light internet users who probably just want to exchange emails and see a few news headlines on the internet. Some of these non-adopters say that the internet is simply a waste of their time, or that they don't think that there's anything worth seeing online. And there are also a list of other remaining reasons that people cited for not being online. Again, non-adoption is a problem with multiple dimensions, and you'll see in a few moments that we took that finding into account in formulating recommendations. The other thing that the survey permitted us to do is to look at adoption across different demographic and socioeconomic categories. Really, the main dividing lines for adoption of broadband in the United States is our income and education. The more wealthy you are and the higher levels of educational attainment you have in the United States, the more likely it is that you have broadband at home. We're also able to look at other dimensions of adoption. You can see that adoption of broadband in rural America is much lower than in non-rural America. And you can see also that age is an important factor in the adoption equation. Senior citizens in particular are just about half as likely to have broadband as people under the age of 65. We also wanted to look at broadband adoption across racial and ethnic categories in the United States, and the findings show that both African Americans and Hispanics have lower rates of adoption than the average in the United States. So with that setup for thinking about the adoption problem, again, that helped us think about recommendations to deal with non-adoption in the United States. So I'm going to walk through actually 4 of these 5 recommendations in the next several slides. Let me just point to item number 2 on this slide about expanding low-income universal support for broadband. That's a very targeted kind of recommendation that goes to providing cost relief, which is the leading barrier for non-adoption. You're going to hear in detail from Carol Maddie about that in a few minutes, so I'm going to spend my time on the other recommendations on this slide. So in thinking about our adoption recommendations, we really had several high-level notions in mind, mainly that adoption recommendations ought to be targeted, collaborative, and local. So the first item I'm going to talk about is the National Digital Literacy Programs, which is a 3-part effort to target resources at people who need to acquire the necessary skills to be online. So the first part of this recommendation is to create a National Digital Literacy Corps. And you can think of this as getting people in the field, helping people who don't have broadband get online. There are models for this in the United States with several nonprofit organizations. A group called One Economy has a Digital Connectors initiative by which mainly young people provide training for non-adopters, again in a face-to-face fashion, so that non-adopters can acquire the comfort to be online and can interact with others with greater expertise to learn how to negotiate online sessions. We also see this Digital Literacy Corps as a way to promote workforce development, not only for the people receiving the training, but also the people providing the training. The second notion in the digital literacy programs is to increase capacity and training in libraries and community centers across the country. Our survey found that about a third of Americans have at some point used the internet at a public library, and we also found that in the current economic climate in the United States, that libraries are increasingly under stress as they try to provide online access to low-income people. Libraries have become a very important place for people without broadband access at home to go to use the computers, to apply for jobs, to look for healthcare information and other things. So a part of the recommendation here is to increase the capacity of libraries to meet this growing demand that the recession has helped spur, to provide access for people who cannot afford broadband at home. The third part of the digital literacy program is oriented not to people without broadband access, but to current users of broadband who may need help with their own skill sets. We found in our research that people's levels of online skills is significantly correlated with the scope of things that they do online. So if you're a broadband user who doesn't feel very confident with the ins and outs of the internet, you're less likely to rely on it for a number of different purposes. So this recommendation is about getting an online skills portal going that will enable people to go to a trusted place, undertake some curriculum training, and we hope improve their level of competency with the internet so that they go from being perhaps somebody who only checks email on an occasional basis to somebody who feels comfortable doing transactions online, looking for healthcare information, and doing other things that might improve their life chances. I noted that a sizable number of non-adopters say that they're unsure of the relevance of the internet, and one recommendation we're making to try to promote relevance is to create public-private partnerships in collaboration with federal agencies to serve low-adopting communities. And this recommendation is really inspired by the notion that while the government has to play a leadership and catalytic role in closing the adoption gap in the United States, the private sector definitely has to be part of the solution. So we hope that by encouraging the formation of these public-private partnerships, we can bring together vendors of computer equipment, providers of internet service, bring them together with key government actors to provide low-cost solutions for people. One example that is mentioned in the slide is HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development. That's an agency in the U.S. that serves a lot of low-income people through housing programs, and as our research shows, many low-income people do not have broadband at home. So if HUD is able to encourage its clients to use broadband, not only does it hold out the opportunity for life improvements for clients, it holds out the opportunity for HUD providing its services more effectively and efficiently. Another part of our relevance recommendations is encouraging a national local awareness campaign, a national and local awareness campaign to promote broadband in low adopting communities. This is about encouraging the private sector to undertake this marketing kind of initiative, not so much to do ads to promote broadband generally, but to really target information campaigns to low adopting communities so that low adopting communities become more aware of how broadband can improve their lives. And finally, we suggest in the broadband plan targeted efforts to improve relevance among older Americans. It's not uncommon when you're talking about broadband adoption for people to ask the question, well, I'm not so sure my 81-year-old mother-in-law really needs broadband. She doesn't think she needs it. And that may be true, yet there's going to come a time not too many years hence when, even though she may not want broadband, her health care provider may want her to have broadband in order to provide services more effectively. So by engaging in these kinds of information outreach campaigns to older Americans, it's hoped that we can encourage them to get broadband and undertake the training to become robust broadband users. The next set of recommendations pertains to enhancing state and local broadband capacity and planning. And this recommendation is really inspired by the notion that in the end, adoption does take place among individuals at the local level, and that efforts have to be made to promote the social infrastructure around the adoption of broadband. So these specific recommendations are all about trying to improve the capacity of state and local governments and organizations to plan for broadband in their community in a more effective way. Under the stimulus bill, the Broadband Data Improvement Act did provide funds to states so that they would have the resources to engage in broadband planning. And we recommend in the broadband plan that these funds be continued so that these local planning capacities can be further expanded and enhanced. We also augment this with an increased focus on evaluation and assessment of adoption programs. One thing we found in the course of doing our research and formulating the adoption recommendations is that there's not a lot of rigorous social science research that shows what exactly is effective in promoting adoption among low-income and people and other non-adopters. So we recommend that as states and localities do their broadband adoption programs, that assessment of these programs be built into the programming efforts that they undertake. We see this not just as a good government type of recommendation, but as a way to promote sustainability of these programs by understanding what is effective in making adoption programs work. And that's linked directly to the third point on this slide, which is the recommendation that we create a best practice clearinghouse for practitioners to share lessons on how to improve broadband access, adoption, and utilization. Again, one thing we found in the course of doing our research is that an effective program in California may not be known to people trying to do something very similar in another part of the country. We want to use the resources of the internet to create a best practices clearinghouse so that this kind of information can be widely shared. Next, we want to, and finally, we want to accelerate adoption among low adopting groups that face significant social or physical barriers. And these recommendations focus mainly on Americans living in tribal areas and people with disabilities. One thing our research showed quite clearly is that in tribal parts of the United States, the availability of infrastructure and adoption of broadband is very low. In fact, there's actually very much a data gap in understanding how low broadband adoption is in these areas, yet it's very clear that tribal areas suffer from very low adoption rates. And in order to address this, we suggest not only improving data about broadband in tribal lands, but creating a tribal broadband fund to improve connectivity to federal facilities in tribal lands. We also spent a great deal of time in our workshops trying to understand issues pertaining to people with disabilities. The survey that we conducted found that 39% of non-adopters have some sort of disability, and the survey also found that among people with disabilities in the United States, just 42% have broadband at home. So their levels of broadband adoption are much lower than the national average. And the recommendations in the plan are quite specific in trying to improve how the federal government thinks about broadband adoption among people with disabilities. The recommendations suggest that we convene a broadband accessibility working group to coordinate federal efforts, and it also, in the broadband plan, we recommend that the FCC establish an accessibility and innovation forum. One thing we found in the course of holding workshops is that innovation at the device level often is not tailored toward people with disabilities, but if innovators were just made more aware of some of the issues facing people with disabilities, there would be a huge opportunity to build that innovation into devices in a way that would address the needs of people with disability, with huge payoffs for people with disability in terms of how they access broadband and how they're connected to the outside world. And finally, with respect to people with disabilities, the plan recommends that Congress, the FCC, and the U.S. Department of Justice modernize their laws and rules to more effectively take into account people with disabilities. So with that, I will turn it over to Rob Curtis to talk about deployment.
Great. Thanks, John. My name's Rob Curtis. I worked on the deployment side or the infrastructure side of determining how to make broadband available to those whom are not currently passed by infrastructure. To my left is Carol Maddie. We'll be doing this a bit together. Carol focused on the policy side of, once it was quantified what needed to happen, actually how to make it happen. So I'll start with what we did on the deployment group, which again was really to try to determine what infrastructure investment was required to make broadband universally available. We had to do three things fundamentally. First, identify a universalization target. Second, identify those housing units which are not passed by sufficient infrastructure to meet that universalized target. And third, we had to quantify the investment gap necessary to provide that target to all housing units in the country. I guess I'm cycling a little fast. So the first thing we had to think about was the universalization target. And fundamentally what we did is an analysis of both the mean and the average usage that we're seeing through a number of different data sets today, as well as look at an application basket and try to determine at a network level what kind of performance in the network was required to support those application baskets. And what we found was that a target of 4 megabits on the downlink and 1 megabit on the uplink really met both sides of that equation. They were close to the average and the median, and were sufficient to meet the application basket. And as it turned out, that turned out to be a pretty aggressive and forward-looking target when we looked at it, what a number of your different plans had come up with. So with that target in mind, we then set out to try to figure out how to quantify the amount of investment necessary to provide that to all housing units in the country. And again, the first step was to figure out which housing units weren't passed by sufficient infrastructure. And that required a data collection effort of its own. And what we had to do was collect both the availability information, who we thought was getting what kind of service, and combine that with what kind of infrastructure data we had. And we ended up building a large statistical model to predict where those gaps were. And what we found at the end of the day was that about 95% of the housing units in our country are passed by sufficient broadband to meet that target, leaving about 7 million housing units that didn't have that target. And then the third step, which you can see on the slide I've got open now, is trying to figure out how much investment would be necessary to close that gap. And we built an economic model, not just a cost model, so we included revenue. And fundamentally what we did is we modeled all the broadband technologies that exist today that are capable of delivering that kind of speed, or that we thought might be. So we looked at fiber to the node, we looked at fiber to the premise, we looked at HFC and its different incarnations through DOCSIS. We looked at fixed wireless and mobile wireless as well. And what we did is, through this model, came up with the most efficient and effective method of, at a very granular geographic census block level, figuring out which technology would be necessary or cheapest to deploy. And we ended up doing this at a pretty granular level. We looked at fiber road miles, we looked at discrete cell tower placements to try to get a pretty accurate view. And what we found in our case was that we needed about $24 billion to close the gap. What's interesting, and I think is perhaps somewhat different here than it is in many of your countries, so we actually have what I would call a hockey stick in linear density, which maps really nicely to this chart here, which shows you the cost curve of providing broadband to the most expensive parts of the country. And actually what we found is that of that $24 billion gap, a full $14 billion of that is required to provide broadband to the last 250,000 households in the country, and that's almost entirely driven by extreme linear density. And so that's basically what we did and went through to think about what was necessary to close the gap. And now I think Carol's going to talk a little bit about how we thought about the policy to make that happen.
Thanks, Rob. The broadband plan makes a number of recommendations on how the United States should achieve its universalization goals. Since 1996 in the United States, universal service has been supported by what we call the Universal Service Fund, which provides explicit subsidies and is financed through assessments on telecom operators, both wireless and wireline, as well as VoIP providers. This year, the Universal Service Fund will be distributing over $8 billion in subsidies, primarily subsidies to telecom operators that provide voice service in high-cost areas, as well as service to low-income consumers. The fund also subsidizes both voice and broadband for schools, libraries, and healthcare providers. The broadband plan makes a number of key recommendations to dramatically overhaul this existing universal service system of subsidies, as well as the inter-carrier compensation system, which is how companies compensate each other for the transport and termination of traffic. The plan recommends that this transition occur in a staged fashion over 10 years. I'll highlight just a few of the key recommendations. First, the plan recommends that we accomplish this working within the existing budget of the current Universal Service Fund by retargeting existing funding towards broadband, but not increasing the overall size of the fund. Second, the plan recommends replacing the existing system of subsidies in high-cost areas for voice service with subsidies that would expressly support broadband-capable networks in those areas. This program, which we're calling the Connect America Fund, will target funding both to those areas that Rob just described that do not have broadband today, as well as those areas that may already have broadband today by virtue of past subsidies from the Universal Service Fund. The FCC will be having a series of rulemakings to implement this recommendation, with the goal of, over time, getting broadband out to over 99% of U.S. homes with the 4 megabit down service that Rob just described. Third, the plan recognizes that while the private sector has made significant progress in deploying 3G wireless networks across the country, there are a handful of areas, specific states, that are significantly lagging behind the national average in 3G coverage. The plan proposes to provide targeted one-time subsidies to subsidize the cost of network build-out in those states, not ongoing subsidies, but just targeted subsidies for the infrastructure, so that those states can be close to the national average, which will then provide a platform for future 4G coverage. Fourth, as John mentioned before, the recommendation in the plan is that we expand our existing subsidy program that subsidizes voice service for low-income consumers to expressly also provide subsidies for broadband service. Finally, there are a number of other recommendations that go to how we provide broadband service to schools and libraries and rural healthcare providers, and my colleague Kristen will touch upon those. The plan also makes a number of recommendations that go beyond the existing Universal Service Fund. In particular, the plan recommends that the U.S. Congress expand existing financing programs that are administered by other agencies. As John mentioned before, the plan also recommends that we create an express fund that would target funding towards tribal populations and Native Alaskans. That's the Tribal Broadband Fund. And finally, the plan also recommends that federal and state governments work together to facilitate the aggregation of demand so that key anchor institutions can get those high-capacity services, which will also serve as a way to get broadband out to the surrounding communities. And with that, I'll turn it over to Kristen.
Thank you, Carol. Hello. I'm here to discuss the way that broadband can truly advance national priorities. And what you'll see here is somewhat a unique request of our government. When we were asked to develop this plan, we were asked to specifically address the ways in which broadband can address national priorities. You see the language on the left from the statute, and the blue boxes on the right illustrate the working groups into which we organize to really tackle these problems. And I will go through each in turn now. From the perspective of national priorities, broadly speaking, broadband is truly a means to an end, not an end in and of itself. And what we're focused on is how broadband can truly be an enabler to solutions to what have been intractable problems in our society. We have tried to look across all of these sectors at ways that there are barriers preventing the optimal use of broadband in these areas, and then tried to identify what key gaps were and develop recommendations to address those gaps. And what you'll see across all of our recommendations are policy changes, funding changes, and in some cases statutory changes to really make sure that we are truly taking full advantage of broadband to meet our national priorities. Some of the common themes of our recommendations include ensuring that public investments are aligned and forward-thinking, and also creating the conditions for greater private investment across these sectors. You'll also see that unlocking the value of personal data is really key to driving a lot of innovation and doing what we hope we can accomplish through broadband across all sectors, which is to actually improve outcomes. So I'll start first with healthcare. You can see here images of new emerging technologies, many health-oriented applications on iPhones. There are close to 1,600 of these, and that number is growing every day. There are many devices that help doctors and clinicians evaluate patients' progress remotely, and devices that use spectrum, such as smart Band-Aids, that can truly help doctors improve the quality of care and reduce costs of our healthcare system. According to some studies, these devices that you see here, a combination of remote monitoring and electronic health records, could reduce costs of healthcare in the United States upwards of $700 billion over the next 15 to 20 years. So there's huge potential here. However, there are a number of barriers preventing us as a country, as well as our doctors and hospitals, from really benefiting from e-care. And our recommendations, which you see defined here, are specifically conceptualized to address these barriers. First, we looked very closely at what incentives issues exist within the healthcare space with regard to use of e-care. And there are a number of policies that the federal government can influence in order to increase the reimbursement of delivery of health care through broadband. And so we make a few specific recommendations about what that might look like over time. The second category of recommendations in health is to really modernize our regulations. These relate to both the delivery of care, some geographic restrictions that are historical in nature and not consistent with the ability of broadband to reduce geographic barriers, and also to regulation and approval of new healthcare devices in this space, so that we can make sure that the regulatory environment is very clear and streamlined and keeps pace with innovation, particularly as telecommunications and healthcare converge increasingly over time. We also make a series of recommendations that we believe will help drive innovative applications and advanced analytics in this field. And this relates to really extending a lot of the standards that we are implementing currently throughout our healthcare data, increasing interoperability so that entrepreneurs can develop new applications and so that researchers can really mine this information, respecting all privacy rights, but in order to figure out what works most effectively and develop new cures for various diseases. And finally, we looked at the connectivity that exists currently in healthcare delivery institutions. And through the Universal Service Program that Carol just described, there is a fund that this agency manages to increase connectivity to healthcare providers. And we've looked closely at the lessons learned in that fund to date, and we've come up with a series of recommendations to really transform it and increase demand for it so that greater numbers of our clinics, both rural and urban, can benefit from higher levels of connectivity and greater affordability. The second key national priority area that we looked at is education. And there are many opportunities currently for broadband to improve student outcomes and make the work of teachers, principals, and administrators much more effective and efficient. What you see here are some images of the way that broadband today is beginning to impact instruction in the classroom. There's an image of a young student in West Virginia, nearby Washington, D.C., who actually discovered an emerging quasar in space thanks to broadband connectivity in her classroom and her ability to access and manipulate data that would not be possible without broadband. You also see e-textbooks, which are emerging and reducing the costs of textbooks and also expediting the rate at which students can access new information. And finally, aggregating this data is very, very powerful because the more information teachers have in the classroom, the better able they are to make data-driven decisions about what their students need in real time. There are some studies indicating the promise of integrating broadband and online learning into the classroom, and studies are indicating that student outcomes in terms of what they learn are comparable, while the amount of time and effort it takes can be reduced and completion rates can nearly double. So in order to realize this potential, we came up with three broad categories of recommendations within education. The first, again using our Universal Service Fund at the Federal Communications Commission, is focused on how to upgrade the program that provides connectivity to schools and libraries. It's called E-Rate. And the recommendations you see noted below that first column really get at how we can increase flexibility of the program, improve efficiency within the program and use of funds, and importantly, use all of this funding, which totals about $2.25 billion a year, to really foster innovation and use of broadband in the classroom. In the United States, virtually all of our classrooms have broadband connectivity, but the real challenge is making sure it is of sufficient speed and teachers have enough skills and tools to use that to really impact students' learning experiences. The second broad category within education is really to promote online learning itself. There are a couple of barriers right now preventing students from benefiting from the potential of broadband. The first is we have a very limited supply of high-quality digital content, and there are a number of steps that our government can take and to encourage the private sector and to encourage government agencies themselves to put more content online and make it available in a standardized way so that teachers and students can pull what they need when they need it. We also have a few recommendations around promoting digital literacy, both for students and for teachers, to take advantage of these solutions, and to make some strategic investments in more online learning systems that will help facilitate all of this. And finally, similar to healthcare, there are several recommendations around improving the transparency and accessibility of data in education, and you'll see some specific recommendations about how we think that can and should happen in the classroom and, importantly, among classrooms throughout the country. The next area we looked at within national purposes is energy and the environment and how broadband can have an impact on our country's meeting our energy efficiency and climate change goals. You can see here images of various devices that are emerging in the home, and as we have a smarter grid for electricity in this country and smart meters that connect that grid to smart homes, we can see much greater energy efficiency throughout the country. And so a number of these applications we try to promote through a few of our recommendations, both to reduce our carbon emissions and also promote greater innovation, and I'll touch on those in a moment. First, we looked very closely at the needs of our smart grid and how to deploy that smart grid at a faster rate through broadband and advanced communications. And there are a number of ways in which broadband and advanced communications can be integrated into the grid, and you can see here a few of the strategies that we recommend in the plan. The first is to make sure our commercial networks are more robust and more reliable, and that they have sufficient resiliency for critical energy applications and functionality to exist. We also want to make sure that the private networks that utilities build have sufficient spectrum, and so to the extent that we are looking at ways that our country can make use of spectrum intelligently, we want to make sure that smart grid needs are taken into account. We also are looking at ways that consumers can have greater access to their digital energy information on a real-time basis. This we found is very, very critical to driving a lot of the innovation that I just described in this field, and really driving greater intelligence into the home and into our buildings, and ultimately enabling our country to reduce its energy use. We also looked at an area of how to address the environmental impact of the broadband that we've been talking about for the past hour or so, and the ways that the federal government can be a leader in reducing the energy consumption, particularly among our data centers. And finally, we've looked at the smart transportation sector, and as broadband increasingly is integrated into our vehicles, what is the role of the federal government in making sure this transition of broadband into the vehicle is done in a way that makes our transportation system safer and more efficient. And broadband can make sure our highways are more efficient as well through broadband communication from cars, vehicles to the grid itself. The next national priority area we looked at is government performance and civic engagement, and these graphics really illustrate the potential of different social media and online tools to improve government's interactions with its citizens, whether through enhanced communication and availability of greater data, or through basic communication between government elected officials, other officials, and citizens themselves. And we looked at ways in particular that services that governments provide its citizens can be made more efficient and be delivered at a much lower cost by pursuing a number of recommendations which you see here. The first, in really transforming government service delivery and bringing services online, relates to, first of all, improving our own internal productivity, whether that's through use of cloud computing or using competitions within government to increase innovation, or through actually delivering increasing numbers of services through broadband online. And there are a number of strategies that we outline in the plan related to secure authentication of identity so that government can really pursue these services in a more efficient manner. The second category of recommendations here relates to using broadband tools to increase civic engagement. There are a number of recommendations around how we can better engage citizens in policy making, decisions that happen in Washington, D.C. and throughout governments in the United States, and also making more data available and transparent so that additional applications can be developed to help citizens with everyday challenges. And finally, we looked at ways that government assets can truly be leveraged to increase deployment of broadband, and that relates primarily to leveraging federal contracts and resources that exist for telecommunications and broadband so that local governments and municipalities can benefit from the cost effectiveness the federal government is able to achieve. In a category called economic opportunity, we looked very closely at the ways broadband can improve and enhance job training and placement, as well as economic development efforts and small business throughout the country. And small business in the United States employs a great number of U.S. workers, and we did an extensive study about their use of broadband, and it turns out their adoption rates are very, very high, but what is not optimal is their utilization of this broadband to really drive productivity gains. So our recommendations in these areas basically do the following. First, we're trying to make sure that broadband is truly integrated into all of our job training and job placement services that we as a federal government provide our workers throughout the country. And similar to the government performance recommendations we just discussed, there are many ways in which broadband can be used to deliver online employment assistance. We also looked at telework and how to bring more jobs to Americans, particularly in rural communities, where availability of jobs may vary based on geography through broadband, and there are a number of policies and barriers to that use of telework that we address in the plan. And then with regard to small business, I discussed some of the utilization challenges. So our recommendations are really targeted at helping those businesses use broadband to increase their productivity. And we're establishing a public-private partnership to help provide greater IT support to businesses and more intensive one-on-one training for how to use tools to take their businesses and expand their customer reach expansively through broadband. And with regard to economic development, we are looking at existing programs through the federal government and how broadband can really be integrated into those programs, not as an afterthought, but really as a key element to infrastructure necessary for economic development in key communities. And finally, public safety. This graphic is meant to be an illustration of the lack of an interoperable communications network for public safety first responders throughout our country. And the recommendations that we developed in this area really focus on addressing that gap. The most prominent of them is that we recommend that a national broadband public safety network be established, and that we, through a public-private partnership, make a significant investment in that over the next several years. There are also a number of recommendations around transitioning our 911 emergency system to a next-generation system, as well as our alerting system. The more we integrate broadband into those systems, the more that first responders can receive information from and respond to emergencies of citizens, as well as notify them of pending emergencies, including public health concerns. And finally, we make a number of recommendations around enhancing cybersecurity and protecting our critical infrastructure. With that, I will turn it over to Phoebe Young to discuss implementation and benchmarks.
Thank you, Kristen. So, as many of you know, because many of your countries have already begun to put together broadband plans or have begun implementing them, the key to progress for any plan, it depends on a nation's ability to institutionalize its efforts and to effect systemic transitions. It's important to note that any country also needs to be able to have the flexibility to make key and expeditious judgments when technology, innovations, market, or other conditions change and demand that. In my prior life as a U.S. diplomat working on rule of law issues, I experienced firsthand the key to success of any plan for any policymaker with respect to any kind of transformative change lies in its implementation efforts. In laying out the implementation recommendations for this plan, we have learned from the experiences of many other countries, including many of those represented on this WebEx. Over 20 countries have put together broadband plans for their respective nations. And in our work in preparing the plan, we found extensive implementation structures amongst key countries like South Korea, Japan, and the United Kingdom. They also had built-in mechanisms to change course where market and technology changes required that to encourage the growth of broadband, both from an ecosystem level but also from an individual entrepreneurial level. Our implementation recommendations center on the recognition that our plan is in beta like the Internet itself and must change and evolve as technology and market forces change and circumstances demand. As you'll see on this slide, we have laid out a few key pillars for ensuring effective implementation. First, the executive branch should put together a broadband strategy council centered at the White House and involving high-level officials from various agencies, including this commission, as well as the Departments of Commerce, Health and Human Services, Homeland Security, Energy, Education, Housing and Urban Development, Agriculture, and the Small Business Administration. We find that in our system it's also very important for the federal government to work closely with state governments as well as coordinate with international bodies as we look towards implementing our plans. Second, the FCC must and is in the process of putting together a timetable which it will publish of plan-related regulatory proceedings. About half of the plan's recommendations fall under the FCC's jurisdiction, and we believe that it's important to lay out a time frame by which we would put together rules and administrative laws to implement the plan's various recommendations. That process is in place, as I said, and within a few weeks we will be releasing a schedule of over 40 FCC actions over the next 12 to 18 months relating to the plan. In addition, we believe it's really important for the FCC and for other federal government agencies themselves to begin to institute transparency in unprecedented ways, and we've begun to do that in putting together this plan. But it's important that going forward, information be made available to the public, and that the Commission as well as the federal government begin to do so by making all public broadband data available in an online depository. So we've recommended that as well. There are key benchmarks in that any plan should measure itself against, and Blair mentioned some of those earlier. We believe that the Commission as well as other federal government agencies should also begin to track and improve and institute new data gathering methods for putting together key performance metrics. These sorts of benchmarks should be collected and reviewed through a broadband performance dashboard to track key progress indicators. For example, the 100 million U.S. households with affordable access to 100 megabits down and 50 megabits up speeds that we have set as a goal over the next 10 years, but also other goals which my colleagues on this panel have indicated for their respective sections. Most of all, in implementing a plan, we subscribe to the view that success depends on being able to capture and adjust to changes and to institute durable policy frameworks to make these adjustments and changes. This plan, as we've said, is in beta, and it always will be. Like the Internet itself, policymakers must be able to adjust, change, and evolve as innovations in technology, economic conditions, and market forces demand. We have tried to put together a plan that anticipates this and lays key institutional mechanisms that enable the U.S. government to encourage the growth and health of a broadband ecosystem that will benefit Americans for decades to come. And we have a lot to learn from those also on this call. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Phoebe. Now we actually have some questions that we've been getting in from our various participants, and we appreciate that very much. And so, Blair, I think I might start with you. There's a question here that we've received that says, I have read on the report that the FCC is planning to free 500 megahertz by 2020, 300 by 2015. Is it published where you're supposed to find the resources for this first step? And I don't know how you would like to intervene regarding the second part of the target, how you're going to make that target.
The plan has a very specific recommendations relating to the first 300 by 2015. If I recall correctly, I think it's on page 84 of the plan, but it's but I may be wrong about that. But it's in the spectrum section. We have a chart that lays out what the FCC is planning on doing. As for the remaining 200, the process begins almost immediately to start that. It generally takes at least 5 or 6 years to reallocate spectrum. So it's a process that has to begin now. But while the first 300 has kind of been identified, the next 200, I think one should think of it in terms of both an effort that begins now between the FCC and other branches of the federal government, looking in this case more at governmental used spectrum, but also with the hope that the market mechanisms that Phil talked about earlier and that we hope to persuade Congress to give the FCC, that as we get to the middle part of the decade and as the market values for spectrum change, that those things will also assist in helping drive spectrum to the uses that technology now enables.
Thank you very much. Our next question is more on the accessibility area. So, John, I thought maybe you could address this question. The questioner says, I'm deeply impressed that the U.S. is adopting the actual speed in the goals instead of advertised speed. However, in the understanding of the commenter, actual speed varies seriously depending on circumstances such as the number of users sharing the same lines and the quality of the core networks. And his question is, how can we establish the standards to measure the actual speed?
That's a good question, and how people perform on a speed test also depends on the capability of their computer as well. But to try to tackle this task going forward, the FCC is working to develop a tool that can become a reliable measure of speed, and that's part of the FCC's overall commitment to try to improve the transparency for the consumer about the nature of his or her service. So we're working on that, and in the process of doing that, we have considered lessons from similar efforts around the world, and would welcome continued input upon those lines.
Okay. Great, thank you. Blair, I have another question I think that would probably be addressed to you. And it says, do the market-based mechanisms proposed to reallocate spectrum to its most productive uses take into account incumbents' incentives to accumulate spectrum to avoid the entry of new players into the market?
It's a great question, and I think that I should be clear that the plan does not address that in particular. And the reason the plan doesn't address it is because I think when you look at the allocation decisions about how you specifically want to allocate questions, that's really more appropriate for the traditional FCC notice and comment review at the time you're doing that allocation. And it went to a level of both granularity and predictability that the planning effort can't do. So, for example, if you're making an allocation in 2014, you may know certain things that we don't know today that you ought to take into account. One of the most important is how much spectrum will be available. If we know, for example, when we're allocating spectrum in 2012, that we're actually going to be able to recapture a very large amount of spectrum, you would look at the question about spectrum caps or other things quite differently than if you are looking at a small amount of spectrum that's going to be recaptured. You also have to look at market dynamics. For example, there are various things that we hope will enable spectrum to be used in certain ways that are not predictable now. So you have to look, that's a market question that really has to be looked at the time that the spectrum is actually being allocated. And we thought it was more appropriate for those proceedings than for a plan.
Thank you, Blair. Now, Phil, we actually have also gotten a number of questions on broadcasting. So let me run through some of those questions, and you can sort of answer the ones that you can and give us some feedback. It says the plan proposes to update the technical rules defining TV service areas and required distance separations between stations. Where does this update come from? Is it a result of the DTV transition, or is it because of new developments? And what is channel repacking? And what allows it to happen, and what effect could it have on the quality of broadcasting services? A couple of other questions are, would the technical rules update and the channel repacking eliminate the use of white spaces in TV spectrum? And then a last question related to those is that, is the FCC planning to reserve some spectrum for future TV broadcasting license auctions?
Okay, well, thank you for the questions. The recommendations in the plan related to broadcast TV spectrum are some of the more complex and contentious ones in the spectrum section, so I welcome as many questions as you have. So Blair started off by talking about some things that are unique about the U.S., and I think this is another particular example that he didn't mention, which is that in the U.S., the percent of the population that actually views television through free over-the-air service is about 10% now, down from about 25% 10 years ago. So declining rapidly and much lower than in many other parts of the world. And it's expected to continue to decline even with the digital transition. So that's part of the motivation that led us to look at, could we use broadcast TV spectrum more efficiently and reallocate some of that towards mobile broadband use. So the process as we thought about it is one, let's look at the rules, the technical rules we have right now that define service areas, and see if we can update them based on technological progress, specifically technological progress on the receiver side. So most of our rules are based on what's called desired to undesired ratios that drive interference and therefore consumer reception. And so if we can look at those rules and see if technology has progressed to a certain point where we can allow more interference and therefore smaller service areas, that might enable us to pack channels more efficiently. Also, we can start to look at, given the trade-offs and between mobile broadband use and the future that enables versus broadcast television and the percent of the population that's viewing that free over the air, we can also look at, are we willing to make trade-offs in the technical rules in order to allow more interference and therefore more efficient use of that spectrum. The second thing that we're looking at is enabling what we call channel sharing, which is two or more stations occupying a given 6 megahertz channel. As opposed to other parts of the world, the channels in the U.S. are 6 megahertz wide as opposed to 8 megahertz wide. And we feel like, again, many of the broadcast TV stations are not using their full spectrum allocation and their full bandwidth allocation, and with the right incentives, could consolidate their operations more efficiently than they're doing right now. Which leads me to the third area, which is the incentive auctions that I mentioned earlier, again, which would provide broadcasters some incentive to participate in this process, either by sharing channels or by deciding to pursue an alternative business model and relinquish all of their spectrum in exchange for receiving some share of the proceeds. Underlying that is the notion that the value of the spectrum in its current use for broadcast TV is much lower than, orders of magnitude lower than the value of the spectrum for mobile broadband use. And then finally, all this would be wrapped up with what we've called repacking, which really is, if you think about the game Tetris, it's can we fit the pieces more efficiently in the puzzle of the TV spectrum than they are right now. And so, as many of you are aware, broadcast television stations have interference protections associated with them that creates a daisy chain impact. So a station in New York City that broadcasts over channel 12 affects stations in Philadelphia, which affects stations in Washington, D.C., and essentially all across the United States. Again, there are opportunities to, once the voluntary incentive auction is complete, to take the remaining stations and pack them in terms of the channel of allotments more efficiently to free up nationwide contiguous spectrum for mobile broadband use.
Okay. Great. Thank you very much. Blair, we have a question that says, do you see the 100 squared initiative target is achievable with the current duopoly markets, or are you going to change this duopoly?
I think there, in the United States, you have to look at a kind of broad, you have to have a broad view of the markets. It is certainly true that for fixed broadband today, generally most Americans have only two options. But those two options are affected by a variety of other factors, such as wireless. And obviously wireless is going to be a much bigger player in broadband in the years to come as we move to 4G and future generations. So as to achieving the 100 squared initiative, I think that, there's obviously a lot of projections, but the current market participants in wireline are both capable of doing it. The question is, will they have enough incentives to move in that direction? And that is incentives, I think we have to look at it both in terms of the competitive incentives, that is to say that particularly the wireless folks pushing them up to increase their speeds, but also in the sense of kind of applications. That is to say, are there applications that drive value sufficient that consumers will actually want that level of speed? One of the things that we noticed in looking around the world is that there are countries that have significantly greater speeds, but the consumers actually using the networks are not using them for any purpose or at any greater speeds than we have here in the United States. And that consumers having a choice of lower speeds in those markets where much higher speeds are available generally choose the lower speeds because you don't have the applications there yet. So I think you have to look at it from a number of different factors.
Thank you. Carol, we have a question from someone about the Universal Service Fund and the aspects of that, and I think you might be one of the people that could answer that best. And the question asks, we seem to be in the process of dismantling a universal service fund scheme originally designed for basic telecommunications services purposes such as the high-cost program, the low-income program. The new proposal in the National Broadband Plan consists of creating new funds, the Connect America Fund and the Mobility Fund. It's not clear to me how the new resources for these funds will come from. Will they be based on previous resources, or will they require new sources of funding? And where will this funding come from?
As I said, the plan proposes to keep the overall size of the Universal Service Fund the same. So the way I like to think of about this is today we have a bank account that's called USF that has an $8 billion number on the bank ledger. We're going to be basically creating a new bank account called the Connect America Fund and the Mobility Fund, and over a period of time we're going to be transferring dollars out of one bank account into the new bank account. So the total size will stay the same, and the funding will be collected as it is today, consistent with our current statutory framework, which requires that the FCC collect funding to support universal service from telecommunications providers. We may look at specific changes to how we collect those funds. The plan recommends that we look at expanding the current contribution base, but the bottom line is the funding will come from the existing sources of funding today.
Thank you very much. Blair, I think we have a question on job creation, and so I thought maybe I would address this one to you. The commenter says that in looking over the National Broadband Plan, the expected outcome of it concerns job creation, but the commenter couldn't find any information except for one or two box sections highlighting expected job creation numbers from some examples, cities and areas. And he's asking whether he missed it or whether there's an analysis or statistics on the expected number of job creations by 2020 as a result of the broadband plan.
There is no final number in the plan for what we expect the job creation figures to be in 2020, and there's a couple of different reasons why. There are certainly a number of initiatives that we think are critical to both job creation and job maintenance. I mean, obviously, looking backwards in history, you couldn't in 1910 project forward to 1920 what the impact of having greater electricity would be on jobs. but I think everyone by 1920 would understand that as a country, you couldn't be an internationally competitive country with having high levels of electrical connectivity. But it would have been very difficult to project forward, and in fact would have involved using a lot of assumptions that would really undercut the viability of that. So rather than project forward a number that relied on so many assumptions, we didn't feel that it would be an accurate representation. We just decided not to do that. A second thing is there are a lot of different recommendations that interlock and reinforce each other, but it is not certain to us which of the recommendations will be adopted and which ones won't. And then finally, a third thing, I think this is very important, at least our view was that whereas a company can project forward for itself what it believes it will do or how many jobs it will need, and it's an important thing to do. There are many factors that affect job creation, both in the economy at large, but even in the broadband ecosystem, that are not in the control of the government. There may be technology developments that make it much more or make it less. There may be market developments. Who knows what happens to the market economy? I mean, obviously, if you were making a certain job projection in 2006 when world economies were riding high, it'd be very different than the projection that you would make in 2008 and 9 as the world went into a recession. That would have nothing to do with particular things with broadband. So there are a lot of factors that don't affect it. Our focus, and we think an important focus, is that the government look at those levers that affect it and make sure that they are utilizing those levers effectively, rather than to say that we can project with confidence a certain number. In other words, if you look at what the government actually does that affects it, use of spectrum, control of rights of way, the Universal Service Fund, we said, are we doing those things as effectively as possible? And the answer in each case was no. Here are recommendations to make them more effective. We think that will lead to job creation, but as to a specific number, we felt it was so laden with assumptions that it wouldn't be an accurate representation.
Okay, great. Thank you. Now I have a question that actually I'm going to undertake to answer. The questioner is from Mexico, and they say, as I understand, a broadband plan will need to reallocate 120 megahertz from the TV bands, including several issues that might have an impact in the border areas. Do you have an approach on the specific broadcasting topics that will need to be dealt with between Mexican and American authorities? And I can basically guarantee that we will be working very closely with our Mexican and our Canadian counterparts on any kind of activities that we undertake to implement the broadband plan, and so don't worry, you will be one of the first to know what it is that we're doing. And we've already started talking about that kind of thing in our own bureau. And so, yes, we realize that this is something we can't just do here in the United States without consulting our close neighbors. So we will be doing that as well. Okay, well, we have another, I think it's a related question to the one that you answered earlier, Blair, about the fact that you can have 100 megabits per second for 100 million households, and whether people are actually going to be needing that amount of bandwidth. And so the questioner says that he thinks that most of the applications or content that we'll enjoy in the next decade will not require such high speed. So why does the broadband plan seek such high specs for networks?
Yeah. It's a great question, and I think, again, we have to have a certain level of humility about predicting the future, because I think if you look back 10, 20 years, most of the predictions about where the internet would go or where broadband would go, can look silly in retrospect. No one could have predicted it, or it would be very difficult to predict certain kind of developments that drive up the applications. And so as we thought about this, we wanted to make sure that in our case in the United States, the government was not stepping into the shoes of the companies in making capital allocation decisions. We don't know whether the best use of capital is to drive up the fixed use to like 100 megabits, or whether the best use of capital is to accelerate the development of 4G networks, which will not be as fast, but have the feature of mobility. There's certainly a lot of evidence that mobility is one of the most highly valued things by consumers. And so if you get to certain speeds and they're mobile, it might be that that becomes the primary way that broadband is being delivered, in the same way that increasingly voice is now delivered over mobile devices rather than fixed devices. But why do we set that as a goal? We set it as a goal because we think that as we look forward, we think there's a very good chance that there will be those kinds of applications, and that in terms of our country, we wanted to make sure that there was a sufficient market so that consumers could, in the United States, both enjoy the benefits of the best applications being developed anywhere in the world, and that by having a market of that size and scope, it would be more likely that applications would be developed for the United States market. We think there are certain benefits for the United States that are very important. We also think there are benefits to the world in having kind of a leading market with leading performance characteristics that can drive the economics to encourage the use of applications that do take up more bandwidth. And that's kind of, as we were talking earlier, we were saying the most important thing is not the network itself, but how people actually use it. But to do that, to kind of drive what we talk about in terms of the velocity of commerce, you need high-performance networks, high-performance devices, high-performance applications, and each of them drive the other sector, the other part of that ecosystem to be better.
Thank you very much. Phoebe, we have a question on the sort of the implementation of the plan, and we the questioner asks that they know that there's been a team that's been working on this issue, and how will the implementation? Will the team continue to work on that, on the implementation, or will it be the FCC staff that will be working on this going forward?
It's a very good question, and what we did very early on is assemble very senior officials within the Federal Communications Commission, but also working closely with other agencies of government to ensure that we were starting to think about implementation as the plan was being drafted. We have had all of the bureau chiefs and office chiefs at the Commission here planning out the implementation schedule that I referenced earlier relating to the proceedings that will be taking place over the next 12 to 18 months. Those bureau chiefs and office chiefs are not going anywhere. In fact, a number of them have also brought on or thinking about bringing on individuals like Carol Maddie here on the panel to help drive implementation in particular areas. And so we have, as I said, been very cognizant of the fact that the institutionalization of these efforts is key to their success, and we have been planning accordingly, and a number of the personnel who have been working on these things on an ongoing basis will continue to do so going forward. Okay.
Thank you, Phoebe. John, we have another question on the actual speed issue. The questioner asks, what does it mean by saying actual speed when you're talking about targets for 100 megabits per second or 4 megabits per second broadband download speed? Does it mean average speed or minimum speed?
Another good question, and one thing that we learned in doing the underlying technical analysis for these set of ideas in the plan is that measuring speed can be very tricky. There can be multiple measures with multiple results, and that's one reason why we're trying to develop a tool that we hope will be a reliable and accepted standard for measuring speeds. So as we undertake that process going forward, we'll try to develop a measure that can understand speeds across the network. I think necessarily understanding what the speed is at any given point in the network will require multiple measures at different points in time. So that doesn't mean that we have an actual speed at one given moment being the benchmark. We want to see how performance is in parts of the network at various times. So it's going to be, if not an actual average, some sort of weighted average most likely.
Thank you very much. Let's see. Blair, we have another question that's related to the 100 megabits per second for 100 million households. The questioner is asking, did we have some specific technologies in mind? Were we looking at FTTX, ducts, IS 3.0, or LTE, or was there specific technologies that it was aimed at?
We aren't directing technologies, but it's pretty clear that fiber to the home can achieve that. DOCSIS 3 may or may not be able to achieve it. Different people have different points of view, but DOCSIS 4 is in development, and I believe that would be able to achieve it. It's difficult to conceive that a wireless provider would be able to achieve those speeds, but if you have a 10-year time frame in mind and you look at the developments over the last 10 years, you should not dismiss that as a possibility. But it's obviously much tougher when you are getting to a spectrum-based solution.
Thank you. And I think this may be a question for either Rob or maybe you, Blair. I'm not really sure. But the question is, did we measure what would happen if the National Broadband Plan is not implemented? So there's a gap analysis kind of thing. And so what would happen if the National Broadband Plan was not implemented?
I'll take a crack at that. I think the question means, of the people that are not currently served, how many of those would be served but for the plan? I think the answer is very few. What we found is that there are a few small geographic areas where it appears that there's a business case to build broadband, but that's an extremely small number of those that aren't served. The fact is that the linear densities of those areas make the cost dramatically exceed what you'd normally expect to get in terms of normal business revenue, which is why we thought there's probably some non-private investment needed to close that gap.
And I would just say that I think there are two different categories when people talk about things that won't happen if if the plan is adopted. The first, and Rob is kind of getting at this, is what happens more slowly. That is to say, certain adoption will drive up to a certain point, but it will be more slow. National purposes, education will eventually adopt the kinds of techniques that we're talking about in terms of digital content using e-textbooks instead of traditional textbooks, but that adoption would be more slow. But certainly, if for a country that aspires to be on the leading edge of all kinds of technologies and uses, it would be very problematic for the United States if we simply take the position that as long as we get there eventually, that's okay. The second category, and Rob just alluded to this, are things that will never happen at all. And obviously the most important is if the plan is not adopted, there will be a significant number of American homes that will never have access to broadband because there is no business case, and there is unlikely to ever be a business case for adopting broadband. And there are a few other recommendations that if for example, one worries, or at least we worry, that if we don't fairly soon create a national public safety network that from a cost perspective rides on top of the development of the 4G networks which are going to be rolled out, it may be that the window will close because the economics will be prohibitive. So there are two different buckets, but we didn't create kind of a single page that talks about all the horrible, terrible things that will happen if policymakers don't adopt all the recommendations in the plan.
Okay, well, thank you. Before I close, does anybody want to add anything else? I think we're getting to the end of our time. All right. Well,
I know I speak on behalf of the whole team. We talked to a lot of different folks throughout this whole process all around the world. We greatly appreciate how everyone was enormously cooperative, and we think that while each country has to have their own national plan, obviously there's a lot of great things to happen all around the world. Broadband is a platform for not just individual countries, but for all of us to make this planet a better place, and we look forward to working with everybody on that.
Great. Well, thank you very much. So in closing today's historic web-based global meeting, I'd like to say that first it's truly special that we were able to conduct this meeting, because without broadband we wouldn't all be here, and neither would all of our contributors and everybody who's been able to talk with us. And so we really do appreciate everybody around the world who's been participating with us, whether it's morning here, it's afternoon in Europe, and then in Asia it's evening, and it's a Friday evening, even worse, as as Phil mentioned. So we really appreciate the fact that we were able to create an international community of people today. I think that was really important. We created a community with a common interest, which is obviously the broadband issue. We're able to share information, and hopefully we'll be able to learn from one another. I think, in fact, the tally that I just got from the staff was that we have about 130 registrants, and they're representing about 35 countries and organizations. So I think that's quite a good thing, and we can sort of think of it as the power of information and communications technology. And this is a first for the FCC. I think it might also be a first for our counterparts as well. So, thank you so much to the panel members for participating in this. We really do appreciate it. And Blair, thank you for your team. We were really interested in hearing about the innovation and investment aspects, the spectrum aspects, inclusion, availability, the national purposes, including the education, health, and public safety aspects of it, and then our next steps in implementation, which obviously some of the questioners were also interested in. And to all of you who participated from around the world, your questions obviously generated a good bit of discussion here, and I think that was valuable to us. And obviously, some of the questions we're dealing with how we're going to deal with our neighbors going forward, and we'll be thinking about that certainly going forward. So, as a final thing, from the vantage point of the International Bureau, we view the release of our broadband plan as a beginning, and it's a beginning of an exchange of ideas with you and on ways to encourage broadband deployment and adoption, and this starting with this meeting here. And I can promise you that the international dialogue will continue. We at the FCC look very much forward to continuing to work with you. And we'd also encourage you to look at the FCC broadband website, which is www.broadband.gov, for further updates, which I think we'll be having some of those updates, some of the things that Phoebe mentioned. And, thank you very much for your participation and interest today. And it's my pleasure to declare this conference a success and to wish you a wonderful weekend here and overseas. And the conference is now closed, so thank you very much.